Thank you for coming today. My name is Purdy. I am the Director of Publicity for Oxford University Press. I hope you're all here for media training for historians. The way we're going to do this today is I have a panel of experts here from print, radio, and online to help you sort of get an idea of what works best in each of those platforms. We have a very brief presentation from each, and then we're going to open it up to you for questions, and this is going to be a little more interactive, so we want to hear what you want to know. But with that, we're going to start first off with Tony Messenger. Tony Messenger has been the Post-Dispatch editorial page editor since July 2012. He joined the PD in 2008 as Capitol correspondent and political columnist in Jefferson City. He joined the editorial page as a writer in 2011. Previously, Messenger was editorial page editor at the Springfield News Leader for 2 years and the city editor and metro columnist at the Columbia Daily Tribune from 1999 to 2006. He is a board member of the Association of Opinion Journalists. In 2014, Messenger won 2 top national awards for his editorial writing: the Burl Osborne Award for Editorial Leadership presented by the American Society of News Editors, and the Walker Stone Editorial Writing Award presented by the Scripps Howard Foundation. He has also won Top Editorial of the Year from the Missouri Press Association. Tony Messenger.
Thanks, Purdy. I think that's loud enough. So I want to start with a bit of a cautionary tale, just to sort of explain a little bit about the workings of those of us on the editorial page and those of you in the academic world or sometimes in your communications arms of universities as they're trying to get op-eds onto our page or our online platforms. So I had an exchange this week with somebody who writes relatively regularly for our op-ed page, and he's somebody who writes about topics that we really like having good op-eds on, and he happens to write from a point of view that generally agrees with the opinion page, and so he gets stuff in our paper a fair amount. But I had a conversation with him this week in which I really had to just set him down and say, would you stop annoying the crap out of me all the time? And this is what happens, and this happens frequently in the op-ed world. So you have an idea for an op-ed and you'd like to get it in the newspaper, so you start with an email, hey, would you be interested in this op-ed? And you don't hear back right away, so you also go ahead and call the editor and leave them a voicemail, because most of us don't answer our voicemails anymore because all anybody wants to talk about is why Benghazi isn't still on the front page. So after that, you get the email, the editor returns and says, yes, we might be interested in an op-ed on that topic. Go ahead and send it to me. Here are the details. They send you the op-ed. Well, it sits in your email box with the 30 other op-eds that you have to consider over the next 2 weeks that you're already booked for. And they leave another voicemail. And 2 or 3 days later, they send another email and leave another voicemail. And so by the time you actually get to the point where you've read the op-ed, you've already spent a lot of time and energy deleting emails and deleting voicemails. And so I wrote this very nice gentleman who I like to publish his pieces and said, just trust me, we already have a relationship. When you send me your op-ed, I'm going to take a look at it, and I'll eventually let you know whether or not it's going to run. So the cautionary tale is get to know the outlets, the newspapers, radio, whatever you're trying to get your pieces published in. Get to know them a little bit. Find out what their deadlines are. Find out what their staffing is. Find out those sorts of details before you start just sending pieces in and creating a situation in which you just get pushed down the pile because they've got 7 emails from you and they just don't want to have to go through them. The reality of the daily newspaper business these days is 4 years ago, we had an op-ed editor, somebody whose job it was to specifically go out and talk to historians and academics and other people and find those unique pieces to put in our paper that were nowhere else that people would come read. We don't have an op-ed editor anymore. Most newspapers the size of the Post-Dispatch or smaller do not. If they do, that op-ed editor is also dealing with 2 or 3 other things. And so unless you're dealing with Chicago, LA, Houston, the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, you're dealing with an editor who's doing 7 or 8 other things and is not just solely focused on trying to get your information published. So keep that in mind. Find out who that person is, who's the right person, how do they like to receive their material, and then after you've gotten through those obstacles, we can deal with the sorts of details. What kinds of things will improve your ability to publish your work from your academic perspective? I'll go ahead and stop there and save those other details for questions.
Thanks. Next up, we have Sarah Russo for online and social media. Sarah has been a publicist in the book industry for 15 years. She specializes in serious nonfiction in a variety of subject areas and literary fiction. Over the years, she has worked with Alfred A. Knopf, Doubleday, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, and most recently was Associate Director of Publicity and Communications at Oxford University Press. She is now an independent publicist working with authors, publishers, organizations, and literary startups on their publicity, communications, and branding. Sarah?
Hi. So I want to actually ask a question of all of you. And how many of you use social media outside of personally, for like Facebook with family and things? Okay. All right. So a few. So I'm here today to convince you that social media is a great idea as far as engaging with your community and talking with people online and keeping a certain level of profile. I want to make a distinction between publicity and marketing, because social media is often called social media marketing, falls into sort of a strange gray area. And I want to just mention this because I feel like publicity has to be earned. You can't buy it. So that's a great op-ed that you have to actually earn a spot on a radio show, book reviews are all earned on the quality of your writing and your contribution. Marketing you can buy, an ad, a spot on the shelf at a conference. You can buy all of those things. You can buy Twitter followers too, but those aren't the kind of followers you want. So you have to earn those people online. And I think it's really important to think about how they're also giving something back to you. So social media is not useful unless you get something out of it as well. So I follow a lot of news sources online. Obviously, if you live in St. Louis, you want to follow your local media people who are here, see what they're covering, and see what specifically they're interested in. And what's great about social media is you can see it in real time. So you actually know what they're covering on the show that day. You can see if they're looking for people to call in and actually comment, and you can do those things because they'll often put out a tweet that says, here's the number, and you can call in. So my 2 big things about social media are be nice and be smart. So, be as forward-facing as you can with your intellect, with what it is that you're really smart about, but also be exceedingly polite, because you can sort of get into a sticky bit if you aren't. And contacting media through Twitter, which is the way I think is best as far as historians are concerned. I don't think Facebook is necessarily the place for a historian to create a great social presence. It's the same as emailing them or calling them. It needs to be short, concise, to the point, and polite as possible. So I just wanted to give one example and how quickly communication is changing. My husband's a birder. He's like a really big into birds. Like, we can't go on vacation anywhere without going after some crazy speckled wallycock or something like that. So, in the past, the way he found out what was happening in the birding world was from the listserv. And he'd get an email, or at the end of the day, he'd get a daily digest of what people had seen. And they still do that. You can still subscribe to the listserv and you still get your daily digest. But if he wants to go chase after a bird somewhere, he sees it on Twitter before he sees it anywhere else. And, the birders are changing, like we all are changing. So Purdy asked me to come up with some examples, but maybe I'll let you guys ask some questions and we can use the examples within that scope, and I'll let Alex go.
All right, great. Next up, from the radio world, we have Alex Hoyer. Alex is a talk show producer for St. Louis Public Radio, the NPR affiliate here in St. Louis. He is the producer of the station's flagship local program, St. Louis on the Air, which often features in-depth conversations about history topics of local and regional relevance. Alex has been in public radio for nearly 9 years, having worked in St. Louis and Iowa City, Iowa. He graduated summa cum laude with a degree in history and social studies teaching certificate from the Western Illinois University. Alex?
Thank you, Purdy. One of the things that Tony said that really struck me is that it's all about building relationships, and I think that's really true. Once you develop a rapport with somebody at a media outlet, that really goes a long way in terms of trying to get your message across. In the brief things that I have to say, I've kind of divided the process of somebody getting on the air. So there's the process of before you pitch the producers, what you need to determine for yourself, and then there's actually pitching the show or pitching the producers, such as me, what to do once you're booked, and then what to do once you're on the show. With what I do, I realize in public radio what I have the opportunity to do is a little unique in that we have these hour-long shows. We really never take an entire hour to discuss one thing, so we will have about 20 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 25 minutes to discuss something, and that's a really long time, so we're fortunate to have that ability, but the things that I'm going to be talking about can really be applied even if that would be a shorter time frame, whether it's a one-on-one interview that's going to be used in a report or something else of that nature. I'd just like to say, overall, as Purdy mentioned, I have a degree in history, so I really value having those kinds of stories told, and I'm really passionate about that. And what I'm really focused on is trying to get the local angle of what happens, local and regional. So if you can tailor your kind of message and your pitch to that of local relevance, I think that's going to be the most successful with a radio program. So before you pitch, you need to determine what you want to communicate. And I've kind of divided this into 4 different things. There can be a national story with a local angle. Just recently, related to the anniversary of the March on Selma, there was a local family here in St. Louis called the Vatterotts, a white family who had been there in Selma, and they decided to go down for the anniversary. And so we decided to do a show with 3 generations of the Vatterott family so that they could give their perspective. So it was a national story that had local relevance. Similarly, we were hearing news recently about the 150th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln being assassinated. Certainly ties to a lot of different areas, especially this area, being that our coverage extends into the state of Illinois. So there would probably be opportunities to provide some coverage on that as well. The topic of a new book, for people who have written new books, that can be a hook for discussing what your work is. And then a local topic that is new relevance. I'm thinking specifically of the events of Ferguson that happened and it was a national story. But if you were someone who has studied race relations, that is your area of study would be relevant again. And then the last thing I'll say is when there are certain anniversaries, that can be more of a tenuous connection, but it can still be something worthwhile to explore. I like to think in quarter centuries, 25, 50, or 75. For example, the 50th anniversary of the completion of the Gateway Arch is going to be coming up later this year, so that would be something that we'd want to focus on a little bit. And if you can't think in quarter centuries, probably think in increments of 5, like the 73rd anniversary. That doesn't really do anything for us. What Tony said in terms of finding out the specific person to pitch to, I think that's important. Do your research and direct your communication to a specific person or a specific program rather than sending a general email. And then with actually pitching the stories, I think email is most effective, and I don't want these long 2-page emails. I want a paragraph that's going to be concise and talk about why it's relevant. I want something that gets me interested in the topic and wants me knowing a little bit more, because when I see an email that's about a page and a half, I'll see that it's a page and a half and I'll put it into a folder that's read this if you have time later on. But if it's a paragraph, when I open the email, I can read it right then. And then another thing I'll say about the email is make sure that the subject of an email is so important. You don't just want to say interview opportunity. or interesting show idea. You want the subject line to convey some kind of relevance, and because there are hundreds of emails that cross our inboxes every day, I'm sure. So it's something that stands out would be really important. And then in terms of when, 3 to 4 weeks in advance is good for us, but it's going to depend on the publication. If it's a magazine, it's probably going to be a lot sooner, a lot more in advance that you need to reach out. I don't know what it would be with you, Tony.
You know, it really depends. Generally with us, 3-4 weeks or something like that, if you're trying to tie something to an anniversary, then the earlier the better, because it's easier for me to plan ahead and say, okay, I don't have anything for that date, and you may be the first one in my list, and so, boom, you win. But often it's the exact opposite with me. Something super timely comes up. I may already have 5 op-eds planned for the next several days, and I've already said yes to these people, and I'm not super excited about some of them by the time it comes time. And Walter Scott gets, shot in Charleston, North Charleston, South Carolina, and somebody's got a new opinion that is directly, timely and related and relevant to my readers. You may sometimes get my attention like that. And so it's sometimes the opposite. But generally speaking, if you're trying to tie something to an anniversary, like the example that I gave in my opening was Earth Day. I still haven't read the gentleman's email on Earth Day, which I think is next week, because he annoyed me. And so it's in my I'm probably going to read box, because I do know Earth Day is coming up, and I've got three other Earth Day possibilities too. But so generally, if you're going to tie to an anniversary, earlier the better, because I'm sure public radio is very similar to us. To the extent that we plan ahead, it's those types of things on the calendar where we are planning ahead, and so fitting in the calendar there can be helpful.
I think that we might have the same Earth Day pitches in our inboxes. And then I'll just say, once you're booked, I mean, there's more that we could talk about with pitching specific people and how to pitch. But once you're booked, find out how long the interview will be, get the basics, what the directions are. If it's TV, what you should wear. Do they have any suggestions for that? One of the things that annoys me is when people ask, and I understand why they ask it, but people ask, what questions are you going to ask me? We have a show day after day after day, so our host and the producers aren't preparing questions usually until the day before or the day of. So we're not going to know what questions we're going to ask. And with a show that's a conversation, if it's a good conversation, we're not going to have a list of questions, and regardless of what you said, we're going to go next on our list. It's going to flow from the answers that you give. So it's perfectly reasonable to ask, what are some topics that you might cover? Is there anything that I should be thinking about that's not obvious? Because if you've been booked, the topic should be pretty relevant. And you can certainly ask, is there anything I should be thinking about that might not be obvious? That is completely fine. Feel free to suggest some other topics of discussion, but don't think that you need to do all that work. That's our job to figure out what we want to talk to you about as well. And then on the show, it's natural to get nervous, whether it's radio and there's a microphone in front of you, or especially with TV and there's a camera there. That's completely natural, and it's certainly easier said than done, but try to imagine it as a one-on-one conversation. I like to tell people that imagine that you're in a coffee shop in the morning having a cup of joe, or at the bar after work, having a kind of an intimate conversation with a colleague or an acquaintance about something intelligent, but making sure that your conversation could be understood by a smart high schooler. Because sometimes we can't talk in the academic sense, I think. And then just being on the radio, tell us why you are interested, because you spend hours and hours and hours on what you've done. There's something that got you excited about it so that you devote so much of your time to that. Tell us where that excitement came from. And I could say some more, but I think that does it for now.
With that, why don't we open this up to questions? Does anyone have a question right off? If not, I'm going to start with a question I have for you, Alex. We often, as a publicist, we sort of act as a buffer. Do you prefer academics or authors to pitch to you directly, or would you prefer that they have their communications department or their publicist pitch you?
I don't know if I have a preference. I think that a well-worded message, regardless of who it comes from, is going to be good. Sometimes the advantage of working with a publicist is that you have a relationship with a publicist for many people, or you've worked with someone before. So that can be advantageous. And it could also be advantageous to have a publicist send a note and to have the historian follow up as well. So I wouldn't say that I prefer one or the other, but working with a publicist, it's their job to communicate with us. So I think there are some definite advantages to having that done, but publicity is expensive, and sometimes you might not have that, and you might be on your own.
Thank you. Yes. So the question is, when the paper reaches out directly to the academic, how do they handle that? And what was the second part of that? I'm sorry.
What should we expect from that kind of comment?
And what should we expect from the interview?
So the first expectation you should have whenever you talk to a reporter or an editor, so that you aren't surprised, is expect that you're on the record and anything that you say may be quoted. You don't want to get into that and think you're having a conversation and then all of a sudden find out, I thought I was just trying to figure out what you were talking about, and they got the quote they wanted and they're done. So have that expectation. One of the things that I tend to encourage news sources to do, and I used to cover politics, so I used to do these talks with new state lawmakers, freshman lawmakers into the Capitol building, and I would explain to them that in the Capitol Press Corps, every reporter has a little bit of a different standard, a little bit of a different style, a little bit of a different understanding of what on the record means. On the record, off the record means something different in St. Louis than it means in Washington, D.C. Background, deep background, all of those types of things. And so even though, while politics is a little bit different than dealing with history, as academicians, sometimes you have universities in which you have to play politics as well. So my first recommendation is, when you're talking to a reporter or an editor, say, are we on the record? Are you quoting me? Just make sure you have some understanding there. And from an editorial page standpoint, this is another opportunity to get your work out there where you're not necessarily publishing an op-ed, but for instance, as an editorial writer, I read a lot of academic studies in areas of which I write about. So I recently wrote an editorial about school finance issues and quoted extensively from a study out of Northwestern. And so there's an opportunity as an academic to get your work out there. I'm going to link your actual paper, your actual work, all of, because everything we do in print now, we also do online. And so that's a really good way to get your work out there, even if you aren't, getting published. I know publish and perish and all of that, but reach out to editorial pages that are writing about topics that you might be interested in, and let them know about your work, because it may help educate study that they're already doing on a particular topic.
I want to direct a question to Sarah now. Sarah, there are, seems like, myriad social media platforms between Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, Tumblr, Google+. How do we navigate this for a historian or for an academic?
I think part of that is understanding yourself and your time and how much you can really devote to this type of a thing. There are people who don't function in 140 characters, and a Tumblr or Medium might be a better platform because it still gives you that social reach and the ability to like and share and cross-post and things that a Twitter or Facebook does, but it's designed in a way that allows you to write longer posts or post photos and things like that, especially for your research. If you are deep into historical documents and photographs, and those are things that you can post on a blog, Tumblr is great for that. There are, on the list that I handed out here, there's a bunch of historians, and I got called out at AHA because Michael Beschloss is not officially a historian, but I left him on there because I felt like, despite the fact that he doesn't have a PhD, Twitter is very, very visual, and that is an easy way to communicate if you have that type of documentation, and it doesn't take a whole lot of time. But anyway, so I'm going a little bit onward lengthily. There are a whole bunch of new platforms that have cropped up in the last couple of months too. Periscope and Meerkat are these new video streaming platforms. If you're giving short talks or even a longer lecture and you wanted to try out something like Periscope, you could basically live stream a class or a discussion you're having with a group of students. That could be useful, and it's brand new. It's literally 2 weeks old, but it might actually end up being really helpful for people who are talking about topics in depth. So it really is being honest with yourself as far as what are the right platforms for you. There's also academia.edu, which is a new platform, not so terribly new, but it's gaining more traction. They have a lot more users. People are posting their papers. You can read and comment. People like me who are interested in your work are starting to gravitate there. I think media is starting to gravitate there. It's a good place to follow topics and be able to just every day in your inbox, whenever something on your topic comes in, you get a list of those papers that people have published. So it takes a little bit of time and thought as far as what you want to spend your time doing. Twitter, for one, is great because it's just so broad and you can find your niche and the people who are interested in that. I find it very useful for just informing myself of the news and sort of what's going on a daily basis. But it also it can become intensely time consuming. So having some sort of an app that allows you to save articles to read later so that you can focus your 15 minutes on engaging and talking with people as opposed to running after links of things that you want to read. I use an app called Pocket. It's on my iPhone. I literally can click it from my desktop or from my phone and save an article to read later. And then, when I'm commuting on the subway, I can read half a dozen articles in my 40 minutes. So there are ways to make your time more effective, and I absolutely recommend taking advantage of those, but it really is just being honest with what's reasonable for you time-wise and how you speak and communicate to people, thinking about what best platform for you to use.
I can add something on Twitter.
Please.
I just wanted to add something on Twitter. The show that I produce has a Twitter handle @STLOnAir, and we will often live tweet during the show, something interesting that was said, or if there's a link to something else that you've done, we want to know that too. So if you're going to be on a show, if you've been booked, let the producer know what your Twitter handle is, because that helps us in linking what we're doing, and it also helps you get more exposure. Or if there's any links, if you have a blog, send that link along too. And in terms of sending things along, we also have a web story based on the interviews that we do. So if there's an appropriate photo, send that along. And I know that there are great photos, often with historical topics. So think about the web material too when you're going to be on a show.
With that, I'm also going to offer just a little bit more advice here. Many of my authors sort of say, I don't have the time to engage with these sort of platforms. They're pulled in 7 different directions. They have professional obligations. I want you to think about the resources that are at your disposal at your institution. So there are usually communication departments. There are usually grad students who are willing and able to sort of help you establish these platforms. Look at these resources that are probably walking right around campus and use them. You can do videos with the communications department and have someone there do the editing for you to post onto a website or your university page. I wouldn't necessarily recommend you start 6 different pages on the internet to sort of host different sort of material. Find one and make that as robust as possible. And then also share that maybe with an Amazon page if you're an author. But do that in consultation. I mean, use your communications department, use the TV communications teams. If you have a local radio station, do some practice with them perhaps, and so that you're ready when the time comes to sort of step it up and you have that practice and it won't be so fresh and new and scary at that point. But look around you for resources. Yeah. I think for me that I've encountered that where I work, and it's because a few people have sort of said something that was highly controversial and off message for a particular institution. You know, my advice to you would be to band together, take your complaints right to administration, and you know, figure out when can you speak to the media directly and when should. I mean, you're all intelligent people. They should trust you to know when to send it up the line for something that's, Blueberry is probably not so important. Policy decisions, yes, you may want to run that up the flagpole.
I was just going to say, sadly, from my standpoint, I think that example is becoming more common, not just in universities, but in state governments, in public policy. It's really unfortunate because from a journalist standpoint, we want to talk to the person who knows the inner workings of government or the inner workings of whatever topic. We don't want to have a filter of a communications person trying to tell us the way they think they want us to know. We want to talk to the professor or the expert or whatever. And here in St. Louis, we've got a robust university community, and I think most of us tend to have good enough relationships with folks at the various universities that we can generally get to who we need to. But I will say in my career, I have found that trend is increasing where it's becoming harder, especially if you work for a state institution, to get directly to somebody who might be the source to get the information as compared to having to work through a communications person. And so I hate that trend. And I would encourage people in the academic world to fight it with every ounce of their being, because it reduces the flow of information. I understand universities wanting to protect their image and their brand and all of those sorts of things, and those are legitimate concerns, but it's a trend that bothers me as a journalist.
I had a question for Alex, actually. You know, as a publicist, when we're pitching radio, we often create a sheet of discussion points or things that the author or expert can speak to effectively. Is that helpful for you for interviews, or would you rather not have? Would you rather be able to produce that yourself? Is it not? Is it more troublesome?
When I get suggested questions, I will skim them, and I think there's there are some that are really good, some that are just not so good, and part of it I think is a pride thing. We don't want to use questions that have been given to us exactly as they're given to us, because then it makes us seem like we're not doing our jobs in coming up with what the good question should be. So I will scan those, and I sometimes get good ideas from them, but I can get just as good ideas from something that's well worded and concise about what some topic areas might be. But supplying direct questions I don't think are too helpful for what I do.
With that said, I would encourage you all, before you go on an interview program, to ask yourself the 7 or 10 most important questions, just to prep yourselves. Because you don't know what the questions are going to be. And if you get one that's out of left field, you may want to sort of say, well, that's interesting. A better question would be, and you can redirect that just like a politician would. Sorry, this is what I tell my authors. So that you know inside and out that you're the expert on these areas, and you won't be ambushed, or if you are ambushed in any way. You know, Fox still exists out there. People have to go on from time to time. If you get a question from left field, you should be able to redirect that. And the best way I would say to prepare is to ask yourself 7 or 8 to 10 very important questions on that specific subject and anything that relates to it. Not, why did you title your book this? That's never a very good question to ask yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And just a second, I'd just like to add to that. On our program yesterday, we actually talked about this conference that was taking place, because it's kind of a big deal that 1,200, 1,300 historians are going to be in St. Louis. That's a big deal. It's cool. But what we were interested in was the fact that there are 2 plenary sessions that are focusing on Ferguson and trying to historicize what's happening in Ferguson. And it's unique with historians because I've heard that you usually like to wait at least 20 years before you talk about something. But I think that when you can talk about what the relevance is right now, that's a good thing, and always be prepared for the question, what do you think is going to happen in the future? What do you think is going to happen next year and 5 years? We asked a historian that yesterday, and he said, "Ooh, we don't like to do that." So I'm going to answer your question this way. And he talked about some of the work that he had done and researched previously that could portend some trends, possibly. And that's something that you can do. But don't feel like you have to answer the question exactly as it is. And if you don't know the answer, just say you're not sure. That's okay, too. I think people appreciate that kind of an answer more than trying to make something up.
Yes.
Read by people from ages 50 up, and maybe the college
question just for the film. The question is, how do academics use Twitter to with their students to sort of engage in an audience?
I honestly, I don't know the answer to that question, so I'm going to punt it to Harvey, who I know is a professor who uses Twitter and is very engaged with his students. Do your students follow you on Twitter? Do you talk with them that way?
Quite a few students do follow me on Twitter. It's funny. It really isn't. I would say where there was a trend, but it actually seems to go from semester to semester. It's just catch as catch can. I might get a class of 25, and all of a sudden they're all following me on Twitter. And I then know that I can actually send out links that I want not only them but other people to make use of. But then I get another semester, which I assume would be like that, and it doesn't happen. And I don't require people to follow me on Twitter.
Yeah, they get better grades if they follow you on Twitter.
Yeah, I've been getting better grades. They do. It's an effective way of brown nosing, I admit. All of a sudden your students follow you, you think you're a little more important in the classroom, I suppose. One time I tried to instigate something. When I broke them into groups, and actually it's a class in which they do a lot of editorial writing, and I actually took their photos and tweeted them, and I think that was a device that got more of them to go on Twitter then as a consequence. So it's not it's like most classroom things. It's a game almost, that kind of thing. But I would say that if you teach students how to hashtag or to look for things by way of hashtags, that might not be a bad way of approaching it.
Another good way to get them to engage is to actually, again, do a little bit of homework, find out who's writing about the Buffalo Soldiers, and tweet at that person. You want to engage them. Twitter is a conversation with other people, so if you see that these 6 people are tweeting about Buffalo Soldiers and they have 10,000 followers, well, you want that person to see whatever you're going to say about this subject area. So you have to do a little bit of homework in order to get that conversation rolling on any social media platform.
But just on a curious side of things, that there are things that I like email with students. What amazes me is how many of them, once they start to follow me, are prepared to take up a conversation by way of Twitter that should not occur on Twitter. And that you have to say, let's shift this to email. Because I don't want to follow them back, so I'm not going to give them access to my direct message on Twitter. There's direct messaging on Twitter. I don't want to follow. It's only very special students I would follow back, to be honest. So it's rather curious that they're prepared to say things on Twitter that I'm not. Because I keep my family out of Twitter. So I don't talk about my family on Twitter. And that kind of thing is, for me, just not to know.
I'm not an academic, and so how I use Twitter may not actually apply, and there are special ethics and that sort of thing that you've got to deal with in terms of teacher-student relationship and all that. But I use Twitter a lot, and I use it for a couple of different reasons. And Sarah talked about almost using it as an AP wire. I mean, Twitter for me today is an AP wire. Almost every bit of news that I consume during the day, I first saw on Twitter. I may not always read the link that I see on Twitter, but when I see somebody tweet about something important, I'll then go find that news elsewhere. And so the key to making that work for you is it's about circles of influence. So I'm a journalist. A lot of people follow me because I'm a journalist, and I post a lot of my work. But if I'm just posting my work, nobody's going to talk to me because I also need to be reposting their work. I retweet a lot of public radio work because we're in the same community doing work on the same sorts of topics. And then we engage in conversations about the news of the day in St. Louis. And people outside of St. Louis are then paying attention to those conversations and learning about our community from there. And in that process, your number of followers grow, and that gives you an opportunity to get your information out and so on and so forth. So just as a strategy, you work for the Park Service, so you have an interest in history, you have an interest in parks. Twitter's great at just doing some searches to find who do I want to be following? Who are the people out there that are posting information that I want to read, that's important to me? And you start there, and then it's just amazing the people that will just sort of flock to you and find you, etc. It's a great way to get information out and receive information. And then once a day, it's just a horrible time suck in which you realize, oh my gosh, I have to walk away from this. But it's a tremendous way to get your information out there and expand your sort of circle of influence.
On the same note, that circle of influence, Alex, I'm interested to know if you do this as well, but we've heard from producers that they are finding information, one, if someone has written an op-ed, two, if they are engaged in social media. So producers have told us that they are looking for guests because they're cropping up on these other platforms. Do you do that, or do you actively seek out guests, or do you have the luxury of just waiting for all these pitches to come in?
It's a little bit of both. We get a lot of pitches, and we will obviously do some, but I'd say that we get many more pitches than what we actually book on the show. But what was your exact question? Oh, where I go to look.
Yeah, if you're looking
Right.
for an expert.
Yeah, I will every morning. I'm kind of old school in that I read the print version of the Post-Dispatch every morning because it's delivered to the station, and I will sit for 20 minutes at my office and just go through and try to go through as much as I can. But then I'll also look at the online version. I'll look at what some of the other media in St. Louis are doing. So I will look for some ideas as to what I might want to produce and branch out into a larger topic. Sometimes it's such a short, just like 2 lines in the Post-Dispatch, and I'll see something and be like, oh, that might be interesting, so I'll look more into that. And then I'll go to Google and I'll go to Twitter. I'll look at that. So when we see something, it can be attractive that a message has been out in the media before, because that if another media organization is kind of signed off on it, you kind of know it's a little credible. So that can be a good thing. But then on the other hand, there are some things that the Post-Dispatch will do that I'll look at and be like, well, why would we want to do that? Because they've already done that. I don't think that we can do that any better. So too much exposure can be a bad thing as well for us.
Yes.
What advice do you have for young scholars or emerging scholars that does not have a book yet, or is not an expert in their fields? Like, how do they, do you even consider that when they come to teach you a story or an op-ed, or how do they build their expertise via social media?
So the question is, for young scholars, what can they do to sort of get your attention if they don't quite have the storied platform of older scholars? Sarah, do you want to start with this about establishing platform or building voice? Or?
Yeah, sure. I think having a certain amount of, it's really about conversations and relationships, and Tony and Alex, I think, both said this earlier. Building up those relationships with people, whether they're producers or editors or journalists or just people interested in your field, that's vital. And it's vital for me as a publicist. Those relationships are what allow me to have someone actually respond to me when I want to talk to them about something. So I think this is the time in your career where you're building relationships. And even if you're not the #1 scholar working in this subset of your field, you still have an opinion, and your opinion is different from everyone else's. So building that and solidifying that, whether, and it's going to change and evolve over time, and that's fine too. That's probably what you should be working on at this stage, and Alex and Tony may have different thoughts as far as how you would approach them, given that you don't have as long of a career.
So the good news is if you're pitching to me, I'm not going to have the slightest idea whether or not you are the top historian in your field or have published 10 books or not. And sadly, it's unlikely that I've read any of them if you have published them, which isn't to say I don't read. I don't read a lot of historical manuscripts. But so with a lot of media, as compared to an academic journal, I don't think that's going to matter. What's matter is it timely? Is it written well? Is it fresh? Does it fit within our deadline and what we're looking for? And that's what we're going to be most interested in if you're directly pitching us. It's more about what you have to say, and if you're a good writer as compared to what your curriculum vitae is.
I completely agree with that. If it's an interesting idea, it's an interesting idea regardless if you have 2 years of experience or if you have 30 or 40 or 50. For example, I'm working on an idea right now that I haven't pulled the trigger on because it has to do with a local museum in town called the Campbell House, which was one of the first private places and is often credited with being the first private place in the United States. And there is one historic home that is left over from that. But that's called Lucas Place. But there were other private places around the city of St. Louis too. And there's sometimes a hesitancy among historians and academics as a whole that if they don't think that they're the foremost expert in something, they'll be uncomfortable in talking about it. But I can guarantee you that you know a lot more than you think. So somebody who could comment on this one private place in St. Louis would be able to talk about the trend of other private places in the entire city. So you should feel free to talk about something that you may not be the foremost expert on. I can guarantee you that you know more than you think you do, and you shouldn't be afraid to expand upon that.
And just briefly, I want to go back to something Alex said earlier. Remember the level. I don't know any newspaper that runs an op-ed with footnotes. So when you send that to me to send on to a newspaper, I have to sort of turn it right back at you and say, I can't send this in. And they're not even going to take a call or a follow-up if you sent an op-ed or an article in with footnotes. I always tell them, write for a precocious 8th grader. You got to remember who your audience is, and no one's reputation has ever been damaged by placing an op-ed on a subject that was written for the level of the audience in that paper. So.
And I would also add that I mentioned that we get a lot more pitches than what we actually book. Don't get discouraged if you don't hear back right away. As Tony was saying, it doesn't help to send an email or phone call every day. It's fine to follow up if you haven't heard back in a few days. Maybe you have an email, then you follow up with a phone call later on. That's okay to follow up, but to do it over and over again will not convince us to want to have some coverage on whatever it is that you're talking about. So if you're not successful with your pitch, it could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe we're full for that programming or full for the newspaper, or it could be the timing is just off. It can be a variety of reasons, and you can always ask for feedback on what could have improved their pitch. And surprisingly, a lot of people who we turn pitches down don't ever find out why that was the case. I find that a little bit strange. But don't be discouraged if you don't hear back, and don't be discouraged if your pitch isn't accepted. Try it again and again and again.
I have a question I want to ask Sarah. How important is rhythm to sort of social media platforms? Can you post or tweet once a week, once a month? How?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It is important. And I'm a terrible offender of this. I go through, little waves of tweets like a day here, and then I'm gone for like 2 or 3 days. But I'm not trying to get on the radio. So, but fundamentally, I do think there is something to be said for some level of regular engagement. And it doesn't have to be hours a day, 15 minutes, 20 minutes a day of finding things that are of interest to you. And this is why I said earlier, if you're not getting anything out of that platform, you're not going to spend any time on it. So it's useful to have news sources or people that you are fond of that are coming in through your feed, and that you can retweet something from the Dispatch or the NPR show you listened to that morning or whatever it may be. And that's content. You don't have to have something original every single tweet. And the people I list on the sheet that you have here, I have a little bit more detail of sort of what they do and why they do it. And there was something that I thought was sort of telling in that, and I just wanted to pull that page back. So of these folks that I have on this sheet, they're all primarily tweeting about historical topics. Liam Fisher tweets a ton, like all day long. He's constantly tweeting. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, Niall Ferguson tweets almost not at all. And the numbers are actually kind of telling. So he's tweeted 432 times in the last 5 years. He has over 80,000 followers on Twitter, which is a huge platform for this subject area. But what's interesting is he started tweeting a lot more in the past couple of months. So he's tweeting once a day or a couple of times a day. So he's tweeted 168 times since January, which is when we did a similar talk about this. So that's in 4 months. He's drastically increased, and it's not taking up hours of his day, but he's gaining some regularity. And what I thought was interesting was in January, he had 76,000 followers. He now has 80,000 followers. That's 1,000 followers a month. That's a big jump. Diane Ravitch and education is so much in the news right now. Her followers have jumped a huge amount since January too, and she tweets consistently, but she's not tweeting just out into the ether. She's engaging with people. She's actually talking to people on Twitter. And that, I think, is telling as well. Michael Beschloss has the biggest following of these 4 historians. But what's interesting is he's not putting any of his real thoughts or ideas out there. He's tweeting a photo or a quote, and I don't think he's actually tweeting at all. He has someone who's tweeting for him. And people are following him, but I think they're following him because he was one of Time Magazine's top Twitter accounts in 2013. Like, there's reasons on a marketing end that people are following him, not necessarily because he's engaging with his fan base or his readers or other academics. So I think there's something to be said for just knowing who your audience is there, and what you can gain from it, and how you can utilize some of that content so that not every single tweet you do has to be original. And the other thing about Twitter is, once it's tweeted, it's gone. So unless someone else retweets you, nobody's going to see that 12 hours later unless they happen to go back and look at your profile and scroll through your tweets. So you can tweet the same thing more than once if it's of importance to you, especially if you have a new book out or you have a paper or an op-ed. Tweet it more than once. There's no reason not to do that. You're just coming up in someone's feed again. Twitter's different from Facebook in that sense, that you're not going to show up in someone's feed twice with the same tweet. So you can go ahead and utilize something a second time or a third time if you want to.
No TV questions? I don't have a TV expert, but Sarah and I have certainly booked enough TV shows that...
Don't wear stripes.
Don't wear stripes. Don't gesticulate up here. Yeah. Watch broadcast news. There's some really good advice about being on TV in that movie. Oh, one more?
I was just wondering, since Alex wasn't listed in the book, what's your last name?
Sure. My last name, it's pronounced Hoyer. It's German, but it's spelled H, E as in echo, U, E as in echo, R. H-E-U-E-R. Great.
And the sheet that I handed out, there's a starter list on there. So if you click on, well, there's no link, but I'll post it on my website if people want to be able to click through the links. Alex and Tony are both on that list, so if you wanted to go find them on Twitter, you could find them easily that way.
I actually work with the Arch, so get ready for that 50th.
Great.
Could be your next guest right there, sitting in the audience. Work done. Anything else? I think we still have more time, but if there's no questions, I'll let you all go. Thank you.